I now call to order the Village of Riverside Board of Trustees regular meeting for Thursday, November 15th, 2018. The time is 7:20. Please call the roll.
President Sells.
Here.
Trustee Lumsden.
Here.
Trustee Peters. Here. Trustee Pollock.
Here.
Trustee Valerie.
Here.
Trustee Giza.
Here.
Village Manager Francis.
Here.
Village Attorney Molina.
Here.
Also present Village Clerk Haley.
Thank you. If you'll please join us for the pledge. Thank you, and welcome to everyone who is here with us tonight and those of you watching at home. If you are here with us this evening and you would like to make a comment to the village board at any time, I ask that you be recognized by the president and that you make your comments from the podium so that the folks at home can hear and see what you have to say. First up this evening are presentations and public comment, and Chief Weitzel is going to update us on awards received by the department, and especially with regard to Detective Sergeant Coder. Chief Weitzel.
Good evening, President and Trustees and Manager Francis. I have two board recognitions tonight. I would first ask that Mr. Patrick O'Mara step up and Officer Joseph Mahana step up behind me. So as the board is well aware, and probably the public, back in September, we had a violent incident take place where we had an ATM robbery on Harlem where the car ended up crashing near the center of town. It was really a very taxing situation on the village police department, and quite frankly, we don't really have those type of situations often. So when the investigation was over, which was joint by ourselves and the FBI, I was contacted by a gentleman behind me, Mr. O'Mara, and he wanted to come to the village board meeting and present the officers with a plaque, not me. So that's why I have Officer Mahana up here, because he was the officer that spotted the car. He was the officer that went after the offenders, and he was the officer that they fired at. So I'm going to have Officer Mahana accept this plaque from Bank of America, not Tom Weitzel. But you will also see that there are many officers here that were either were at the scene or actually worked the case as an investigator. So Patrick has a background as a police chief in the south suburbs, but I'll let him introduce himself to you in his new position, and I'll be back up at the podium after that. So it's all you, Chief.
I think I've got the cold that everybody else is fighting with. But again, my name is Pat O'Mara. I'm a Senior Vice President with Corporate Security with Bank of America in Chicago. Two of my teammates here are present today, Brian Cody and Mike Shields. Mike Shields dealt extensively with members of the Riverside Police Department during the moments after the robbery and in the days that followed. It was September 24th, about 9:30 at night. An ATM technician was dispatched to repair the ATM at the Bank of America branch at 3300 Harlem. As he was repairing a bill changer or something, four armed individuals rushed him, produced a gun, told him that the money wasn't worth his life. He complied. The offenders fled in a vehicle, and Officer Mahama, if I'm pronouncing it right, actually stopped the vehicle before he put two and two together and knew that the folks he had stopped were actually involved in this violent bank robbery. And we call it a bank robbery today because ATMs really are they're the banks of tomorrow. As he called for additional units, the folks in the vehicle, the 6 occupants in the vehicle, figured out that, for lack of a better word, their goose was probably cooked. And they then took off, pursued by the Riverside police officers. They made it a short distance. Several shots were fired at the Riverside police officers. They rolled their vehicle and hit a tree. All 6 of the occupants of that vehicle were arrested, some treated minorly at local hospitals. 4 of those individuals have been charged either federally with bank robbery statutes or statewide for robbery statutes. A number of guns were recovered from the vehicle, as a number of spent casings were recovered. Bank of America's got some 200 plus banking centers in Chicago, so we deal with law enforcement on a relatively frequent basis, and I can tell you that the professionalism of the Riverside Police Department ranks up above the top. So before I forget, the officers that were involved in this, and as the chief said, it looked kind of, in a smaller department, everybody kind of pitches in, but the main officers were Officer Mahala, Officer Kudla, Officer Panic, Officer Simpson, Officer Navarro, Officer Greenwald, Detective Coder, Detective Lazansky, and Deputy Chief Guchik. So for all the people here in the audience today and those that are watching on TV, when you lay your head down on the pillow tonight, rest very, very comfortably knowing that you've got a very, very good police department here that's protecting you at all hours. So, officer, congratulations and thank you.
So I asked Joe if he wanted to speak, and he said no. So I'm going to speak for him. So I'll just brief the board on, Patrick was correct. Almost every single officer worked this case. When my phone went off, probably about 9:30, which isn't uncommon as chief, but the phone call I got was not common. And my deputy chief beat me to the scene, so did my operations lieutenant, Frank Lara. When I was there, we had many, I want to make clear, we had many police agencies assisting us. When I arrived, Berwyn was there, North Riverside was there, Lyons was there, and Brookfield was there. And our entire fire department was there, either providing assistance with lighting, their trucks, or in some cases, just helping us pick up some of the money. But I want to tell you that there were residents that came out of their homes and turned in money to the officers. There were residents that came out of their homes and offered the officers water were there. And the days that followed, many residents came into the police department to give us food. Unsolicited, and they just walked in and they would say, "Chief, just give this to the officers," and they would disappear. They didn't want any thanks. They didn't want any acknowledgement. And you know, that's amazing to me as chief, that our residents not only supported the officers, including the fire personnel that were on the scene that night, the night it happened, but they would come into the station in the days to follow. But I do want to say that Officer Mahana was outstanding. He spotted the car, he quickly put together what had happened, then they took off. And it was only about maybe 30 seconds or so before they rolled their car, about 80 East Burlington. 6 of them were all injured. They all tried to flee. They were all caught. And it was complicated. There were males, females, juveniles. There were 3 guns. 2 of the guns were reported stolen, taken in other crimes. One of the juveniles was a reported missing juvenile out of Orange County, California, which caused us a lot of complications. They all had to be hospitalized. We had to guard all the prisoners. We had to still conduct the investigation. So we heavily relied on our neighbors to assist us under the Mutual Aid Pact that this board has continuously approved. So when we've come in front of the board in the past and asked you to approve mutual aid agreements with our neighbors, and we've explained to you why we need those, this board has always supported it. Well, we used that mutual aid agreement fully that night. And officers were assigned to the Riverside Police Department well into the next day. So it was a great effort by all involved. I will have more to say about Joe in the future and the other officers here that worked this case, but I did not want the board and the residents, because when Patrick said he wanted to present the plaque to me as chief, I wanted to make sure that I had nothing to do with this. My role is to give the officers the ability to do their job and give them the training and to let them then to step out of the way and do their job, and they did their job. I only showed up to make sure things were going right. But many of these officers worked for 48 hours straight to get the prisoners either into the FBI for federal processing or into our local court system. So I'm very proud of the force, and I'm very proud of everybody that worked there, and I just wanted to make sure the board knew that. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
I have one more award and acknowledgement. If Sergeant Leo Coder could step up by me. So I'll start briefing you on what took place. So on Friday, June 9th, 2017, Riverside Police Department was asked to assist Lyons and the Illinois State Police with an armed subject at actually Ogden and Joliet. Earlier that day, a female had been murdered in Sycamore, Illinois, by her estranged husband. Her estranged husband walked up to her as she left for lunch in her place of business in front of her 8 friends. So she was going out to lunch with 8 coworkers, and he shot her in the head. This was also captured on video that afternoon. Shortly after that homicide, the Illinois State Police spotted the car, and they followed it on I-55, and it exited in Countryside. They followed the vehicle to Lyons at Joliet and Ogden. They didn't really intend on making the traffic stop there, but the offender did. So the offender got caught up in traffic by P.J. Clems, and he was facing eastbound. And he immediately opened fire on the officers. This included officers from Lyons, Riverside, and the Illinois State Police. He exchanged gunfire with the officers, and he was subsequently killed. The officer squad cars were shot. There were bullet holes pulled from the Lyons police cars and the Illinois State Police, including the Lyons police squad cars' engine block, their hoods, and some through their windows, and including the state police. Sergeant Coder was on the scene when this took place, and he did exchange gunfire with this offender. But more notably, there were residents and citizens of Lyons walking the streets, and all the businesses in that area were occupied, and several of those rounds that the offender shot went off into those areas. Thankfully, nobody was shot or injured, including our officers. So that case was eventually turned over to the Illinois State Police, and then eventually turned over to the Cook County State's Attorney's Office for review, as all officer-involved shootings are. And that shooting was cleared some months ago. So how did we come to this point? Well, it was a miracle that Sergeant Coder happened to be working. He's currently the detective sergeant. On that night, he was not. He responded in his marked unit. Leo's highly trained as a NIPAS officer, which is he's our officer, or was our officer till recently in his promotion to detective that served on the SWAT team. He was well trained. He knew how to engage this individual. Certainly this was a tragic situation, no doubt. But the officers were fired upon first, and they only returned fire. I'm extremely proud of Sergeant Coder's actions. He stayed there that night, and he had to go through all the protocols everyone does in this situation, including mandatory hospitalization, and then follow-up with professional counselors, and then being released back to duty. But it was very difficult for his wife and family who are here, and I'm going to have Leo introduce his family too. The night this took place, I was attending a wedding in Michigan, and my phone went off, and I was at the rehearsal dinner on that Friday night up in northern Michigan, and I told my wife, I said, you'll have to catch a ride tomorrow with your sister. I have to go. So I got in my car and drove back about 4.5 hours. So by the time I got to the scene, it was probably close to 10 o'clock at night. And I walked up to Sergeant Coder to make sure he was okay, and I phoned his wife to make sure she knew what was going on. And she did, but we wanted to make sure that the rumors didn't start to spread. And there was a lot of media coverage there the night that happened. And that media coverage was handled by the Illinois State Police and the Lyons Police Department. And I will make note that our fire chief, Matthew Buckley, who's behind me here, at the time was still working for the Lyons Police Department, and he was also on the scene. So I want to read the recognition that I want to give to Sergeant Coder tonight. It's the Riverside Police Department's Valor Award. It's presented to Detective Sergeant Leo Coder for his response in assisting the Illinois State Police in 2017 in the pursuit and felony stop of an armed homicide suspect when the suspect was stopped in Lyons. The offender began firing at police officers, and Sergeant Coder, along with other officers, engaged in this intense gun battle and ultimately resulted in the culmination of the incident. It's going to be presented by myself, Tom Weitzel, and my deputy chief, Bill Gutchick. But before I present this to him, I also want to make known that the Illinois State Police Director, Leo Schmidt, wrote me a letter probably about 6 weeks ago and invited me to a ceremony with Sergeant Coder down in Springfield. It was actually held in New Berlin, the town right next to Springfield. And they presented Sergeant Coder with the single highest award the Illinois State Police can give to a non-state police employee at that ceremony. And the director of the state police commented on stage of Sergeant Coder's professionalism. I attended that ceremony along with Deputy Chief Gutchick. So I just want the board to know you have excellent officers that work for you. They're compassionate. They don't seek these incidents out, but they're well trained. And when they come, our residents can rely that the officers will respond appropriately and handle the situation which comes their way. So I want to congratulate Sergeant Coder and present him with this award.
Thank you very much. I've been up here a couple times. Somebody had mentioned they see me up here a few times before receiving a couple awards, and I always fail to do one thing. So gotta say who's here tonight, and I see her getting looking at me already. So I just want to thank my wife Jennifer for obviously a lot went on that day, and she stood by me. My daughter McKenna. The guy who I think is more excited about this award than me is my son Leo. My mom's here in the crowd, my godmother and my Uncle Louis, so I just want to say thank you very much to them and the board, and definitely the police department for standing behind me. The chief did mention something about somebody sitting behind me. He said at the time, Deputy Chief Buckley at the time for the Lions Police Department, me and Matt had been on SWAT together for about 17 years, so to see, a bad situation and see somebody who I've been through a lot of things with roll up, it just was a sign of comfort. And so I appreciated him that night, and I don't know if I ever told him that, so there it is. So thank you very much. So,
Mr. President, that's all I have unless you have any questions, and I thank you.
You've left me speechless. It's a testament to our police department and under the leadership of Chief Weitzel. We see this over and over again, the quality and the courage of the people who keep us safe, and we're very, very grateful for it. And thank God that Officer Mahana and Officer Coder, Sergeant Coder, are with us safe. It could have been otherwise. And to their families, thank you for your courage and for sharing them with us. We appreciate that very much. So we'll move on now to public comment. You are welcome to comment now, or if there's a particular agenda, I see your hands. If there's a particular agenda item you'd like to wait and comment on, you're welcome to do that also. Yes, sir.
Good evening. My name is John Mack. I'm the president of the Hoffman Dam River Rats. I'm a Cicero resident. Village Clerk Haley gave me the permission to hand out some papers before the meeting. You should have a copy of something that looks like this on the front. Okay? And then there's some, like 4 or 5 pages back. What this is the Department of Natural Resources fish sampling survey, and it's done almost every year. I don't think we've missed too many in the last 10. And on the front page where it says G39 Swan Pond area, that's the result from the swinging bridge as you go up the river as far up the rapid as we can get. Where it says G44, that's the river from Forest Avenue going north to approximately the Salt Creek Bypass Tunnel. There's a bunch of fish totals, names, and scientific names. The second page, anything that says G39 is Swan Pond, and these are species, and they are the number of the species, the length, and the weight. And this is a survey that's been done for many years. And if you go all the way back, on the last page, you will see that on the last page, which is this one, there are survey listings from 1983 to 2013. So there's 30 years worth of survey work that's listed here. And as you can see from that page, in 1983 to 2013, we've about doubled the number of fish species. So this is a really good indication of the improvement that's going on in the river as a recreational resource. And I don't know if anybody in the board has ever presented this listing to you before.
No,
And this has been going on since about 1997. Okay. And I didn't think anybody had ever presented it to you. I thought you just might be interested. It's just for your information. I thank you for the opportunity from Clerk Haley to let me pass them out. And is there anybody has any questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
What caused the massive increase? What are the results?
Well, everything, basically what started the increase was when they passed the Clean Water Act in '72. If you had the listing that's prior to 1983, it would be about half of what's on that sheet listed under 1983. So the Clean Water Act is what started it. The Hoffman Dam removal improved the upstream end a lot because it stopped the fish blockage from happening. But just in general, the Clean Water Act and the fact that you can't dump raw sewage anymore under normal conditions has done a lot for the river. But it's becoming a better recreational resource, and we'd like to really try and promote that if we could. So, anybody else have any questions?
You're doing a great job.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
thank you, Mr. Mack, appreciate it very much. We should put this on the village website, because we've been in contact also with the fisheries with the IDNR, and they have also mentioned the significant impact that the removal of the dam, the Hoffman Dam, had on really an exponential increase in not only in fish, but birds, amphibians, and other wildlife. So it's been quite a success. Mr. Gallegos.
Good evening, Mr. President, trustees, those in attendance, and to those watching at home. Sir, I come before you and the village board on behalf of the Chamber of Commerce. It is my privilege to inform the public of upcoming chamber events. If today's snow is any indication, the holidays are fast approaching. And if you're watching this live, you are missing out on the 2-year anniversary celebration at La Barra. Tonight, they'll have drink specials along with live entertainment until 9 o'clock. So you have about an hour and 15 minutes to stop by and congratulate Mary and Pat and the La Barra restaurant family.
And just for the record, every single trustee just checked the clock.
With Thanksgiving being next week, Riverside Foods will be able to accept orders for turkeys on Friday and Saturday only online. And they will be open for special hours on Thanksgiving from 8 to 1. November 24th will be the open house for Higgins Glass Studio. It is the second oldest business we have here in town, and you will be able to see all the magic happen backstage on that day from 10 to 6 p.m. That little bit of trivia might want to lead you to the next question of what the oldest business in town is, but if you're interested in trivia, Thursday, December 6th, 34th Lounge will have trivia night that night, beginning at 7 o'clock, which is the next night I'll be appearing before you to talk more about the holiday stroll, which we are still finalizing those details. So far, what we know is that Santa Claus will be at the water tower at about 5:45 that evening. We will have the horse and carriage rides available. We will also have transportation out to Harlem Avenue for Santa Claus, which will be at the comic book store. And I'll be back again on December 7th to tell you more details. And that's all I have for tonight.
Thank you very much, appreciate it. Anyone else like to talk to the board right now? Okay, moving on then, we'll go on to the reports of village officers. I had no report this evening, manager.
I just have a brief report for residents. It is anticipated that Kenny will be completing their construction within the village of Riverside by the end of the year. Because the weather has started to turn extremely cold, we're not sure that restoration will be complete by the end of this year, until they'll have to come back to complete restoration. I thank residents for their patience these past couple of years with all the construction that has been occurring throughout the village, whether it's been resurfacing or sewer separation. all of those various projects have come to a close. Next year, we will have a lighter capital year. There will still be impact to residents, but not necessarily as extreme as it's been in past years. So that's all I have to report.
Thank you. So moving on now to the approval of the consent agenda. On the agenda tonight, approve the voucher list of bills November 15th, 2018, approve the Village Board of Trustee regular meeting minutes of November 1, 2018, file and review the following: Economic Development Commission meeting minutes September 13, Community Development Department October monthly report, the Fire Department October monthly report, and the Police Department October monthly report. Also on the agenda, a resolution authorizing the village manager to create a purchase order in the amount of $200,000 for the purchase of water from the village of McCook. A resolution authorizing the village manager to create a purchase order in the amount of $32,225 for the purchase of rock salt from Cargill, Inc. for the 2018-19 snow and ice control. And a resolution appointing a representative and alternate to the governing board of the North Suburban Employee Benefit Cooperative. Does anyone need anything removed for discussion? Hearing none, I'd ask for a motion and second to approve.
So moved.
By Ms. Peters. Second. By Mr. Gisa. Please call the roll.
Trustee Lumsden.
Aye.
Trustee Peters. Aye. Trustee Pollock.
Aye.
Trustee Valerie.
Aye.
Trustee Giza.
Aye.
Motion carries. Next up are reports of departments, commissions, and trustee liaisons. Are there any liaison reports this evening? Hearing none, we will move on to ordinances and resolutions. First up is an ordinance amending the text of Section 10-5-9, Table 4, the use and bulk requirements tables for the B1 and B2 zoning districts of the Village of Riverside zoning ordinance relative to daycare centers. Director Apt.
Yes, we received an application for a text amendment to allow daycares in our B1C zoning district. The petitioner, which is Happy Times Child Development, is proposing to open a child daycare over on Harlem Avenue, right there at the intersection of Long Common and Harlem. They have concurrently requested a special use permit to open their child daycare center, and that ordinance is second on the list because the text amendment has to get approved first in order to grant a special use. The Planning and Zoning Commission did conduct a public hearing on both the text amendment and special use permit. They did recommend approval of the text amendment on a vote of 7-0. The proposed text amendment before you adds special use, daycares as a special use in the B1C district only. And it references the existing standards that we have for that use already in the code. There are already existing definitions in the code as well. Currently, daycares are only allowed as special uses in our B2 Central Business District. So this would add them as special uses in our B1 district, which is primarily located on Harlem Avenue and a little bit on Ogden Avenue. So the Planning and Zoning Commission concluded that the text amendment is not inconsistent with the intent of the zoning ordinance and that allowing daycares as a special use in our B1C district would be a benefit to the community and recommended approval of the text amendment. The Preservation Commission also reviewed the proposed amendment. The Preservation Ordinance asked them to provide you comment on the effect of any proposed zoning ordinance text amendment on our landmark designation, and they determined that it would have no adverse impact. So you have the text amendment before you, the ordinance adopting it. If you do adopt this ordinance, then we'll be able to adopt a special use ordinance if you approve that, and that's next on the agenda. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have, and the petitioner is also here to answer any questions that you have.
So before we get to that, I'd ask for a motion and a second to approve the ordinance.
So moved.
By Mr. Lumsden.
Second.
By Ms. Peters. Discussion, comments, questions?
I do have one comment or clarification. Since this was pushed through as a special use permit, that means that the neighbors within what
Yes, all the
distance
neighbors
were
within
notified?
250 feet were notified.
Okay.
Yes.
All right, thank you.
Other comments?
The text amendment, we still decide on this particular business at the special use, which
Correct.
is the next part. So this is only to allow them,
Correct.
okay.
Just the code change, not any specifics related to this specific use.
It's basically to allow the potential for a daycare to go in the B1.
As a special use
As a special use.
with notification of neighbors, right?
Correct.
Correct.
Because without the text amendment, no one could even apply for a special use in the B1.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else? Please call the roll.
Trustee Lumsden.
Aye.
Trustee Peters.
Aye.
Trustee Pollock.
Aye.
Trustee Valerie.
Aye.
Trustee Giza.
Motion carries. Next up, an ordinance approving a special use for a child daycare center at 2722, 2726 South Harlem Avenue, Happy Times Child Development, Inc. Director.
Yes, currently, well, now, the zoning code actually does allow daycares as special uses. The petitioner applied concurrently for a special use permit to locate a daycare in the shopping center that contains the Shining Smiles and To Your Taste over on Harlem Avenue. Let's see, the surrounding uses and zoning are either business district or residential. The properties to the east are located in Berwyn and include the Berwyn Public Library and Public Storage. The daycare will serve children ages 0 to 12 years of age and will be open from 6:30 in the morning till 6 p.m. in the evening, Monday through Friday. The petitioner is estimating that the daycare could care for a maximum of 50 children and that the daycare will have 9 employees. A final determination for the maximum number of children will be determined by DCFS once zoning approvals are secured. The shopping center where the daycare is going to be located has 16 parking spaces on site and has access from both Harlem Avenue and Long Common Road. The petitioner has stated the drop-off and pickup will occur at different times throughout the day. They will not be providing an on-site outdoor play area. However, they have obtained preliminary approval to utilize a nearby park, Proxa Park in Berwyn. The Planning and Zoning Commission had some concerns and questions about where staff would be parking, how many employees would be working at one time, and how pickup and drop-off would work at the site. Some of their concerns were that employees would be parking on the street, and there was some concern about the impact that would have in the nearby residents. There was also concern about how drop-off and pickup might be impacted given the proximity to the intersection there at Harlem and how busy Harlem Avenue is. And in that kind of high traffic volume level, there was also discussion that they would like to see that there be some sort of plan in place, and some thought being given to how that would be handled and how they would be directing parents to enter and exit the site. The petitioner has stated at the meeting that she intends on having 6 full-time employees and 4 part-time employees, and that she anticipated recommending that they park off-site so that more of the parking in the parking lot is available for the other businesses and for her clients. And she also stated that pickup and drop-off times typically take only about 5 to 10 minutes, and the peak drop-off time is typically between 6:30 a.m. and 8:30 a.m., and neither of the other businesses are open during that time. She also mentioned that 50 children does not necessarily mean there will be 50 cars utilizing the space. Families will typically have more than one child enrolled in the daycare. She noted that she currently cares for 20 children, however, there are only 8 families and therefore cars that make up that number and come to her current daycare facility. She stated that peak pickup time is typically between 3 p.m. and 6 p.m. The other businesses are open at that time. I believe the dentist's office does close about 6 p.m. During the weeks. So the Planning and Zoning Commission held their public hearing. They did recommend approval of the special use permit with the following conditions: that a building permit, occupancy permit must be obtained by the petitioner, a sign permit must be obtained for any exterior signage, a copy of the state daycare facility license must be provided to the village, a copy of the state fire marshal approval, if needed, must be provided to the village. They must provide their state approval of off-site outdoor play area. And then the 2 additional conditions that they recommended on that evening was that the proposed use, those are the regular findings that they have to do, that it's not going to cause any substantial injury to property values, and this is the first time they're applying, so it has not had, don't have to worry about 1 year elapsing since any previous denial. But they did ask that they provide a no left-hand turn sign on the exit onto Harlem Avenue, so that people cannot turn left onto Harlem Avenue directly out of the parking lot, and that also that they provide a drop-off and pick-up plan to the parents, and that be provided to the village. So the petitioner has provided a copy of their drop-off and pick-up procedures that you have in your packet. Basically, they're requiring everybody to enter off of Long Common Road. and that nobody would be allowed to make a left-hand turn, so they either have to exit off along Common or only turn right onto Harlem Avenue. Additionally, the property owner was notified regarding the no left-hand turn sign being required, and he stated that he had no objection to making that limitation and posting that sign. So the petitioner is here to answer any questions. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. You do have the ordinance before you. And
Okay, so, excuse me, sir. Not quite. First, I'd ask for a motion to approve a special use permit for a child daycare center, Happy Times Child Development, Inc. at 2722-2726 South Harlem Avenue in Riverside.
I'll move.
By Ms. Peters,
Second.
by Mr. Lumsden. Discussion, comments, questions?
I have a question. Maybe it's for the petitioner, and maybe I missed it in the video, but how will the kids get transported from the location to Proscott Park? There's 50 kids.
I'll let the petitioner
What's-
answer that. Ms.
You need to come
Castellano,
up
could you
to
please
the,
come up here?
And if you could introduce yourself, please.
Hello, my name is Marisol, and we will have different classes, so they will not be going on at the same time. So we will have different teachers at different times.
So you did
And
like-
we will cross Harlem Avenue. We will cross Lawn Common and then Harlem Avenue together.
By foot?
Yes.
You mentioned that you have received preliminary approval for Proscott.
Yes,
Who
and
gave you that
only DCFS, only verbal. They say they're not gonna give me anything until any zoning is approved.
Other questions?
I do. The footprint of the building, have you done a build-out plan so we know what's gonna be inside that unit as, I mean, you're gonna have, right now you have 20 kids, am I correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I mean, you're gonna have to have classroom areas, sleeping areas, or whatever. Is there a build-out plan that shows how that is gonna be, where the desks are gonna be? Because as that gets laid out,
Not as of right now, because I haven't actually got the building yet. So I won't do that until I actually get the building.
well, see, I think what you're asking me to do is give you permission to do something that you haven't even figured out if you can do yet. I mean, you know, DCFS hasn't looked at the space. I understand the place isn't sprinklered. You don't know how many kids you can put in there. You think 20. You don't even know that. You think maybe 50. I would think that it would be prudent for you to have a plan, even if it's a rough plan that says, I want to put, you know, in this corner is where I'm going to put my desks. This is going to be the classroom. This corner is where I'm going to do my 0 to 3-year-olds. This corner is where I'm going to do this. This is going to be my office area. And then have that rough plan given to our village. So our building department, our public works department, and our fire and safety can go over and see if you can even do
Yes,
this.
I can definitely make that because I currently own a daycare home, so I'm familiar with that. I can definitely make that, but unfortunately, the final decision, DCFS is the one that has the final decision, so they actually have to go and measure, and they will tell me where you can put this, where you cannot, so I can give you that, but then the final decision, it will be by DCFS. It might change.
I understand where you're coming from, but I can't set precedent and give approval for a daycare center on this without having at least our village, building department, building inspector, and fire and safety go through the building to make sure you can even put 20 kids in there. So I mean, I think you need to put something down in writing so they know what's going to be done. And there's things that need to, you know, that you have to have in this house, you know, proper egress and ingress, or, you know, doors both front and back, sprinkler systems and all kinds of things. And I don't know if you're aware of all this stuff.
I did talk to DCFS, so I am aware of a couple of things. They did say they do not require sprinklers for daycare centers.
I still think that the first position we need to do is have our our fire and public works go through that building and make sure that it's adequately protected, because it's, you know, if something happens in that building, we're the ones that gave you permission to put 20 kids in there.
I understand.
So I think that's the first thing that need to be done. I don't want to put a permission before we know it's even feasible.
Yes, unfortunately, the way that DCFS works is that the first thing that they want is the zoning approval. After the zoning approval, then the fire department, and they want all those departments in there. That's how they work.
Well, they could say the way
And
they want to work, and
unfortunately,
we
I
can say
cannot
the way
change
we
the
want to
rules.
work.
That's their rules.
Yeah,
Thank you.
okay.
Other comments?
I did have a question. The drop-off and pickup plan, I think you said it was in here and looked at it. Has planning and zoning looked at that, approved it? It said that it was part of the requirements, but I wasn't sure if it was looked
Right,
at.
the Planning and Zoning Commission said they didn't need to see it, they just wanted to make sure that one was provided and that some thought had been put into it. So they didn't necessarily want to hold it up and say we have to review it, but they wanted one to be presented to the village board and make sure that it was at least thought about and that there was going to be something that was going to be given to the parents to direct them how to best enter and exit the site and handle the drop-off and pickup.
Yeah, just that intersection is so hard, right? It just makes me feel like I would look to have a second opinion about that plan and whether or not that's going to work for that intersection, right?
Yeah. You have a one-car queue on Harlem and basically a one-car queue on Long Common. So, I mean, the only prudent way of leaving there is right outside of, take a right onto Long Common and come through Riverside. I'd go around and get out on Bird or somewhere else. I mean, I don't know how you can queue up onto, it's gonna be a tough turnaround, even if you come in and go out, because that's not that big of a parking lot.
Mr. Powell? I'm sorry, were you finished?
No, I'm not, thank you.
A question for Director Apt. I believe I heard you reference that there's a possibility of a need for off-site parking or a concern about that. Could you clarify that for me?
The petitioner said at the meeting that she was going to be directing her staff to not park on site, and had recommended that they would be parking either on the street or perhaps across Harlem Avenue over in Berwyn, in order to make sure that parking spaces are free for the parents coming in for drop-off and pickup. There are 16 parking spaces on the site. It does exceed the requirement for that building for our zoning ordinance, so there is sufficient parking there per our ordinance for a commercial building, but in her statement, she had said that's kind of how she was going to try to plan to work around the parking situation and the cars coming in for the families.
I have a question if I could ask it.
You need to go up to.
Children and safety has always been my prime concern. And I didn't hear enough dialogue or planning for safety for the children. Generally, will there be a medical person on staff to take care of children? The other thing is that in event of a fire, is there plenty access for fire trucks to get in there and out? The other thing is that when I hear that it takes a woman 5 minutes to drop off a kid, I'm a little suspected of that. So the whole traffic situation concerns me, especially with children. And so, I agree with Joseph that unless there's a detailed plan itemizing all of the procedures, codes, regulations, safety requirements, impacts to traffic, and things like this, I don't know how anybody could approve this. And I leave it with that.
Thank you, sir. Other comments? Is anyone interested in any kind of motion to table pending more information, or?
Are we to discussion? I was
Yes.
thinking we were still on questions, but for
Yeah.
discussion.
Discussion.
In terms of the land use, we just approved an amendment to allow this as a special use in this zoning district. So now we look specifically at this property and whether this particular property is appropriate for this land use. And I'm very concerned about the congestion. A daycare is unique in the sense that it's not a high-volume traffic generator, but it generates all the traffic at one time. It's a high peak hour traffic generator, so you're going to see congestion at morning drop-off and at afternoon pickup, and I just don't know that this property is suitable for that type of use.
Other comments? Are we ready to vote? Please call the roll.
Are we voting to approve it, or are we voting
No,
to
the motion-
table it to get more information,
The
like a diagram?
the motion is to approve.
So if we wanted to table this for.
That would take precedence.
If anyone wants more information, you would have to make a motion to table to a specific date and then let us know what information you wish to have.
I'm leaning toward tabling because I just don't have enough information. I agree that that site is obviously a very congested corner. We're dealing with children. The last thing we want is a situation where we don't have a good plan and people pull up on Long Common and kick their kids to the curb and they have to run across there and there's a problem. And I see what you've written in the document, but in diagrams that I'm used to seeing is similar like that the school provides us over at Central, where X number of kids are gonna get out of here from this time to this time, and it shows the flow in the diagram. That's what a parent's gonna need to know how to properly drop their child off. And I think we have a responsibility to make sure that that happens, to make sure that that's good. Again, I think the other thing that Joe mentioned is a floor plan. When I'm looking at these diagrams, I see exits, but I don't see what kind of barriers or paths that might be involved in that. And again, the only reason I'm really concerned about that is the children's safety as well as our fire protection folks that are gonna have to go in there and try and help somebody and make sure that it's a safe route to and from, and that then you guys know where that's at so then you can plan for that. I mean, we're working on technology so that you guys can get floor plans en route to responses, and we don't have that. So that's the kind of information that I would like to see, and that would, to me, justify tabling it to allow you the chance to do that.
So you're interested in the drop-off pickup plan and then a detailed floor plan? Did you also want an evaluation by our fire department?
Yes.
I think that first things first, we have to get a plan, so then
Right.
we can actually have a look at it and make sure that they're comfortable with it. I'm pretty sure that the other authorities are gonna wanna see that as well, right? And I just know you haven't had a chance to do that yet, right? Yeah.
Is there other information that?
Again, I would like to reiterate that once that plan is done, that it should be facilitated through our building department, our public works department, and then our fire and safety, that they give their recommendations. Because that'll give us the amount of occupancy. That'll help you with deciding if you can actually reach your 50 or whether 20 is a stretch. So I think it's important for both us and it's important for the business.
In the meantime, I'd like planning and zoning to look at the drop-off and pickup plan. Just want a second opinion about it, since we may have extra time.
When is the next planning and zoning commission meeting?
I believe it is the Wednesday after Thanksgiving. So is that the 27th?
28th.
28th, thank you.
So the current plan right now is that we're going to have our first meeting in December 6th. The plan was to not have our second meeting in December because of the holidays. So I can't imagine that this could be accomplished by December 6th. So if someone wants to make a motion to table, if I believe I'm correct, Mr. Molina, that it needs to be to a specific date.
It does. It can always
You
be
can always,
moved
you
again.
can always
but-
retable it.
Right, but it's because of the notice. It's so anyone would be able to track the notice.
What would be our first meeting?
January 3rd, if
Do
we're having that.
second meeting in January, please.
Pardon me?
Second meeting in January, I would recommend.
Okay.
Second meeting, which would be the 17th.
January 17th.
Does that work for the
Yeah.
petitioner?
Yeah.
Would January 17th work for you?
Give you enough time
And-
to put that together.
And to Mr. Molina's point, if she isn't ready, then we can continue it to a further meeting, so it's not like a deadline for her.
Right, as you may recall, that's happened to us
We've
before.
done this before. So is that?
I will make a motion to table this to allow the petitioner the opportunity to provide that information to date specific of the second,
January 17th, 2019.
what he said.
Is there a second?
Second.
Sorry?
Second.
By Mr. Gisa.
And then there doesn't need to be withdrawal of the earlier motion because a motion to table takes precedence.
Okay. Call the roll, please.
Trustee Lumsden.
Aye.
Trustee Peters.
Aye.
Trustee Pollak.
No.
Trustee Valerie.
No.
Trustee Giza.
Aye.
And that passes because it's procedural,
Right.
so we don't need a fourth.
Okay.
This is purely procedural. If it were on the ordinance, you would need to vote.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much, and thank you for coming this evening.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you, you too. Happy Thanksgiving. Next up is an ordinance amending the village code of the Village of Riverside and the Village of Riverside zoning ordinance relative to vacation rentals. Director.
Yes, as you know, we've been walking through vacation rentals through the summer and through the fall, and we are finally coming to a close. So at your September 20th meeting, you adopted an ordinance that removes the vacation rental license for the residential districts and adopted various changes to our licensing regulations. You determined that vacation rentals were not an appropriate use for the residential neighborhoods and would be best suited to our business districts. Since vacation rentals are listed as permitted uses in our residential zoning districts, in our zoning ordinance, a text amendment was also needed for the vacation rentals to be prohibited in the residential districts. The village board also requested that the Planning and Zoning Commission consider changing vacation rentals from permitted uses to special uses in our business districts. So the Planning and Zoning Commission conducted a public hearing on the proposed text amendments last month. Based on your previous actions, the proposed text amendments removes vacation rentals completely from the use table for the residential districts, thus making it prohibited. The amendments also changed the use designation for vacation rentals in the use table for the business districts from permitted to special. The Planning and Zoning Commission was in agreement that if there was no license for vacation rentals in the residential districts, that the use should be removed from the use list. They had some questions about the need to make vacation rentals a special use in the business districts. Some commissioners noted that if the neighbor notification and village board approval was already a part of the licensing process, they did not necessarily see reasoning behind changing the use designation. And other commissioners did not like having duplicate processes, while others did not think that vacation rentals needed to be special uses in the business district. Some commissioners believed that redesignation to a special use was a bit of an overreaction, while others thought that given the newness of the use and some of the unforeseen issues that have already arisen from a previous vacation rental, that designating it as a special use was prudent. Ultimately, the Planning and Zoning Commission recommended to the board approval of the proposed text amendment, removing the use from the residential zoning districts on a unanimous vote of 7-0, and recommended approval of the text amendment to change the use designation from permitted to special in the business districts on a vote of 4-3. As this was a zoning text amendment, the Preservation Commission also reviewed this. They reviewed this yesterday to make their comment on whether it would have any effect on our landmark designation. The Preservation Commission determined that there would be no adverse impact with this text amendment change, seeing as we've been doing fine without vacation rentals for many, many years prior to 2016. So that was their determination. So you have an ordinance before you that does remove the vacation rentals from the use table for the residential districts and changes the designation to a special use in the business districts.
So I'd ask for a motion and a second to approve the amendment.
So moved.
By Mr. Valerie.
Second.
Mr. Gisa. Any further comment on this? Please call the roll.
Trustee Lumsden.
Aye.
Trustee Peters.
Aye.
Trustee Pollak.
Aye.
Trustee Valerie.
Aye.
Trustee Giza.
Aye.
Motion carries. Thank you, Director.
Thank you.
Next up are considerations. These are general discussion items for which no final action will be taken. And first up is a discussion regarding the Groveland Avenue Levee Flood Risk Management Project. and the intergovernmental agreement with the Army Corps of Engineers and the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District. Manager Francis.
So just as a brief summary, we began this discussion on April 5th of this year. We've had subsequent meetings and discussion and various questions posed by residents within the village. With regard to the PPA, which is attached, and also the intergovernmental agreement with the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District, those are attached and within the packet. The PPA is essentially their base model that they have with a couple of minor modifications to it. The PPA really cannot have any substantive changes to it without it having a 6-month Pentagon review. Actually, we also have a representative from Army Corps of Engineers here this evening, Jeff Zucker, and he can address any questions additionally that the board may have after I finish going through the agenda history sheet. With regard to the PPA, there have been certain items that have been incorporated with regard to a side letter that has been provided by Colonel Ressinger of the Army Corps. The letter is included in the packet. And if the village determined during or at the completion of the design phase that we did not want to move forward with this project, we would not be obligated to do so. With regard to the design, I wanted to point out that it is important to note, because we've been talking about the design phase in a more global sense, and it is important to differentiate that there are actually 2 different phases of the design. The design process for the purposes of the project itself, the functional design, and then the specification design phase. The functional design phase, which includes establishing the location, height, and providing the visual impact on properties in the area. The second phase of the design is actually creating all the specifications that would then be incorporated into the bid. With regard to remediation, it also should be noted that any environmental remediation costs would be the sole obligation of the Village of Riverside should the project move forward. Additionally, we had talked about, I would say, in late spring with regard to betterments. I believe it was Trustee Lumsden that had brought it up briefly with regard to enhancements on recreation and the possibility of those types of things. Betterments would be incorporated as part of this intergovernmental agreement with both the Army Corps and also the IGA with MWRD. It would be a 50-50 split instead of the typical 65-35. The estimated costs associated with these various recreation features, the cap anyway, would be approximately $460,000. The village is working to incorporate this into the IGA. And then additionally, residents had requested previously having some sort of tentative schedule with various agreements and the phasing of those and when it would be presented to the village board, and so incorporated in the agenda history sheet is a current proposed tentative timeline with an estimated date in December of the PPA being signed. And then obviously on that same date, we would have the intergovernmental agreement between the Army Corps of Engineers and the Village of Riverside, and then it has subsequent dates that could potentially be subject to change. One thing I'd like to also note, because I believe it has been voiced previously, is whether or not preservation would have review of the wall. And yes, that is the case, that they would, in fact, and they've discussed it previously, of when they would be able to provide their feedback. And it wouldn't be until we begin the design phase, but they would absolutely have feedback and be part of the process. This item is for discussion only. Our village attorneys have done an excellent job of incorporating things to make sure that the village is safeguarded with regard to this project. And additionally, we also, as part of the discussions, have found that if the project does move forward, the flood wall is built, we would do annual inspections. However, if there was substantial damage done to the flood wall, that actually the Army Corps comes in and does annual inspections as well, that we would actually have to turn over those inspections to MWRD to validate that we're doing dual inspections. But if there was significant impact to the flood wall, they would come and do the repairs.
For how long?
I believe it is 50 years, but I'm sure Mr. Zucker could correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, that portion goes on indefinitely, as long as you continue to do your inspections and you follow up, and we're out here and we approve everything that you're maintaining it. If there is damage that occurs due to a flood event, it's a public law that allows us to come in and repair that at 100% federal cost.
This is a general discussion item, so it's open to the trustees. Anyone here with us tonight?
So I think that one's important for everybody to understand is because as long as we do our obligation of conducting a inspection and any of the routine maintenance, i.e. mowing, tree trimming, not letting unusual growth and things like that happen, that then at that point, it reduces our risk. If we fail to do that or don't budget to do some maintenance or something like that, that is when the risk would trigger. Did I state that properly?
Yes.
Thank you.
Do we have any idea what an annual budget would be to do this? Do you, I mean, what does it usually cost to maintain a flood wall, not maintain, but inspect a flood wall per whatever? There's got to be some sort of history here that we can get some sort of idea what our costs would be?
I believe in the feasibility report, we looked at the 50-year lifespan, an average of $17,000 a year. Some of that might be more in 1 year over another based on replacement or repair costs that could be incurred in that. With the flood wall, what you're talking about really a lot of times is inspection of the joints. There's a joint compound material that helps keep water and other material out. It helps ensure that the flood wall stays intact. You'll have to inspect that, and it could need to be replaced. Years where that would be replaced would be years where you'd see a higher cost. If we end up with a pump station to help keep water out from behind the flood wall, the same would be with that. You'd eventually need to replace those pumps that would be in there. We would anticipate something slightly larger than a normal sump pump you'd see in a home, so a couple $1,000s to replace those kinds of things.
Is the $17,000 the cost of the village is maintaining it, or are there fees from the Army Corps of Engineers?
There's no fees from the Army Corps of Engineers. We come out to help with your inspection free of charge. We provide a report to you that can be passed along to MWRD as well. So our fees are all covered as part of that. So the cost to the village for those annual inspections is whoever you send out to be a part of that inspection, just paying them to be there.
If I could ask a question?
Shoot, go ahead.
Okay, sure.
She'd just stay up there.
I have worked with the Corps of Engineers, and they know how to build walls. But one of the things I'm not sure is in the report is any social economical impacts for doing it or not doing it. And I'm not sure if that has been evaluated. As far as maintenance is, I think $17,000 is kind of high, but that's neither here nor there. The other thing is that you said a certain percentage would be paid by Riverside. So do you know what the total cost is to Riverside, and how is that money going to be, obtained and used?
So if we had to do any type of remediation?
No. I thought you said that the cost of the entire operation was divided.
The recreational
The
pieces.
recreation was a 50-50.
And
And in speaking with MWRD, it is within their wheelhouse, and they would be inclined to pay for certain betterments, but that would be something that would have to be evaluated. Also, in speaking with Mr. Zucker, it could be something that the Army Corps would potentially allow, and it would be considered a betterment. So it would be the 65-35 split versus the 50-50.
yeah, 65-30 means nothing to me. It's just cost.
The-
Do we have an idea of what the cost is going to be? That's all.
So on the split, the amount that the village would have to possibly incur had to do with, as we go through the design phase, and this is a result of me, I know that that's the case, is that there's an opportunity. The Corps will only provide the flood protection. In order to beautify that, or to allow certain points of additional access to get people down closer to the river for canoeing, kayaking, using it as recreational, there may be some additional costs. The question was asked by us when we met with the Army Corps, how is that processed? If we want to come up and say we'd like to beautify something, i.e. put a logo of Riverside in a portion of the wall by the bridge or something like that, how is that funded? And what he's came back to tell us is that they're willing to put it in the documents, i.e. so it gets built with the project, and then anything would be a 50-50 split. In addition to that, some of those things like an access point may be included in the scope that they will fund 100%.
So we're talking about minor costs, not
We're
major.
talking about, yeah, we just wanted to have the ability, as we meet with the village neighbors, and we go through some of these design options, and we're putting something in someone's backyard, if they wanted an access point to the river, how would we be able to facilitate that, and how would those costs be handled properly?
My other question was socioeconomical impacts, if you do it or don't do it. Has that been put in the report?
With regard to the benefit of the different
Anything,
structures?
anything.
Yeah, there's been different evaluations that are done. So we have this comprehensive webpage of different data that's been collected. Probably one most notable is the flood risk summary from 2017. Hold on, sorry. That actually that has an estimate of how many structures would benefit from this particular flood wall. So the project benefits, what they're averaging based on the Army Corps' numbers and various reports and data that they've collected, is the average annual flood damages would be reduced by $441,000. Average annual cost, $264,000. So the net benefits to Riverside residents would be $177,000.
All right, my question is that you're satisfied that there was ample comments addressing that issue, that's all. And I understand you're happy with it. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Oh.
Can I just clarify one thing? The recreational features that you could request would be cost shared at 50-50. Betterments would be at 100% non-federal cost. But so,
100%.
Non-federal cost. So the federal government doesn't pay for betterments.
So if it was construed as a betterment.
If it was construed as a betterment.
Right.
Correct.
We've-
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And the current project estimate for total is about $7.5 million.
Jeff, can I ask you one question before you sit down? The wall on this side of First Avenue, this side of First Avenue, the one the berm that's already there.
Yes.
Sits at how many? Okay, whatever.
616,
Okay.
I think.
So we're going to make a wall on the other side, obviously, of course, the same height.
It will be, yeah, so we're aiming to have the entire wall be at 618.2.
Right. So we know, I think and we will be unable to berm it like we did at the other side just because we don't have the land to do that. Am I correct?
Correct. A flood wall takes much less space than a berm would, and so we think that that's the best solution in this place.
So I think two things that we do know is that there will be a wall of 618, give or take, feet by 2 feet wide, give or take, going from Forest all the way to the bridge.
Correct.
We know that.
Yes.
We don't have to know what it looks like. It's going to look like cement. I think we should at least put that in front of our Preservation Commission and tell them what we're doing. Because at least they can say, it doesn't take a lot to envision this. And if they look at this and say, you know what, I don't think that's going to be an impact to our historic landmark, but they may come back and say, you know what, that's going to be a major impact to our historic landmark. And I don't know, I think that would sway some people's opinion on whether this is good, bad, or indifferent. So I think we should put this in front of preservation before we get too far down the road, because I think that's an important.
That's what we did. That's what we did. We made sure that we had, after the design phase, the first design phase, that it goes back through our loop again. We verified that we can.
Preservation
take time to do
hasn't
that.
looked at this, is what I understand.
No.
It would be as part of the design phase. So what Trustee Lumsden is saying is we have to get something for them on paper
But
for
we
them to
do
be able to
know
evaluate.
certain things. We do know it's gonna be 600 and something feet.
Well, 618, that's an elevation.
We do know the height.
Yeah.
We do know the thickness, and we do know what it's gonna be made of. Doesn't matter if it's over here, or if it's over here. We do know it's gonna stretch from forest, and it's gonna stretch to the dam, or to the bridge. We could give them that information and have them, I mean, it doesn't have to go through design phase for them to at least look at this and say, you know, it's good, better. I mean, I just think it's prudent to keep them in the loop sooner than it is later, because as far as we go down the road, it just gets more and more expensive. Because we get another thing from the Army Corps, we get another thing from MWRD, our lawyers have to look at it, everyone's looking at something, so everyone's kind of taking on. I think one of the easy things we could do right now is get this in front of at least preservation, so they can at least weigh in, just their thoughts.
I think it's great. We're trying to build consensus and get everybody involved, so I have no issues with that. I was more concerned about making sure that we had within the internal agreement that we had the opportunities at those positions to have the time and the opportunity to do that. And have your participation, and yours, to present that.
I'd be happy to participate.
Yeah, I hope so. No, we all want to. So, I mean, that's the process going forward.
Please.
I love Colleen Toriumi. I live on Maplewood. To your point, Joe, I think if preservation knew something that Mr. Zucker had mentioned earlier in some of his presentations was that we need to basically clear cut 15 feet on either side of this wall so that the roots from the trees do not impact or penetrate the wall and deteriorate it. Is that not correct?
Yes, that is correct.
I mean, that's a huge impact. You look just down where the berm is right now, and you look 15 feet west, there's dozens and dozens and dozens of trees there that will be impacted. Some of the neighbors went out and we measured. And we counted over 80 trees. So I'm sure the village would be interested in that. And also, when you look at where the wall is going to go east down Park, and you look at all those trees that are impacted on the very south end of Maplewood Road, you look at where that south end of Maplewood Road fences are, and there's beautiful trees there, absolutely gorgeous, and all those trees will be gone as well. Because it's 30 feet of trees that will be gone, and the wall will be in the middle of that. That's a huge impact. And when this gentleman was speaking about the impact, have you ever thought about the negative impact of property values of the homes that will be in the surrounding area of the wall? I mean, if someone is going to be looking at my home on Maplewood, they have to go through an area and view this very large wall. And to me, I think that would be a very negative thing. I would never buy a home that has a wall that close to it. I did have a question for you, Ms. Francis, about can you clarify what you meant when you were saying that you would be providing a visual impact? I didn't quite understand what
No,
you
that
meant.
Army Corps would be providing a visual impact.
What does
So
that
as
mean
part-
specifically?
So they would provide various visuals to residents with regard to the design, should we move forward in that phasing. So it would be various public meetings with public input for the residents that are impacted, so that they could understand visually what they would potentially be seeing from their home and from different viewpoints within the village. But Jeff can additionally expand upon that if I had missed anything.
Thank you. Okay, I might have this wrong, and I apologize if I do, but I was reading through some of the materials for this meeting today, and I seem to remember that there was a question in it, or some sort of situation that wasn't really clear to me. Is there a time in the design phase that if we pull out of the agreement, that Riverside the Village of Riverside is then financially responsible or liable for some of the costs that have been incurred up until that point?
With regard to MWRD, that is correct, because we're taking money that would have gone to another community for their project if we choose not to move forward.
Well, that is that's a pretty, that can be a fairly negative point, don't you think, that that the village would be taking on that if we decide to pull out? And it's also a disincentive for us to pull out if we see something wrong, because we're negatively impacted financially. That's a concern for me as well. Other concern I have is that we never received any feedback, not from any of you, not from the Army Corps, of the photographic evidence that we presented in July. We were told by Mr. Zucker that the river water had never come up to the houses, and we showed very clearly that it did. We were told by Mr. Zucker that the river water never hit the bridge, and we showed clearly that it did. And we were also told by Mr. Zucker that the river water had never gotten into the street. And once again, we did show very clearly that it did. And no one has ever responded to that. So I just want to make note of that. The final thing is, we've been told over and over and over that the measurement of the base flood elevation is 615.3 or 615.5, right? And that the wall, I went through the videos, and I found it 4 times, Mr. Zucker saying this. He said, the base flood elevation is 615.3. You add 1.5 feet to it, and you get 618. Now, I was gonna do like a Karl Rove whiteboard thing here, but I decided not to be that obnoxious. But it really isn't 618, it is 617. So is this of concern to anybody that we're a foot off on the height? 615.3 plus 1.5 feet is 617. It's not 618.
Right. What we talked about in the past is adding 2 feet, 2 feet to the existing berm.
You've said over and over and over, I have it on video, 615.5 plus add 1.5 feet, and you get 618. That's what it said.
I could have said that. I could look back at it. It's possible that I was mistaken at that one.
There were 4 times that I found.
It's very
It
possible that I was
concerns me.
mistaken.
It concerns me though. We're talking about a $7 million project, and it concerns me that we can be this inaccurate. Thank you.
Peter Schoenman, 235 Maplewood Road. I want to thank the board again for entertaining our concerns. I know that you've worked to answer our questions, and we finally got a little more clarity. A debt of thanks goes out to Burke Engineering, and thank you, Mr. Zucker, for being here tonight. And also, the director of the Illinois Department of Natural Resources was kind enough to weigh in on some of our concerns, which some of you may have seen. I had a question about the cost-benefit ratio, and I've heard a couple of different things through this process. Mr. Zucker, you said that for every $1 that you spend, you have to save $1, and that the cost-benefit ratio as it stood for this project was right on the cusp, around 1 point something, just above 1. And Ms. Francis, you said that the benefits or the costs for, claims would be around $400,000 per incident, flood incident?
That was based on data collected by
Based on
Army
data.
Corps.
And so then the benefits you said were 200 something.
You can go back to their PowerPoint, hold on just a second.
I believe that's the village cost, right? That's not property individual's cost, basically. That's a good point to clarify those.
Well, yeah, I mean, because it's not the best cost ratio.
So based on project summary from September 10th, 2015 by Army Corps of Engineers, it states on page 5 of that presentation, project benefits, annual average flood damage reduced by 441,000, average annual cost 264,000, net benefits 177,000.
So there is a cost. Do you have any idea, does the village have any idea, where people are going to incur costs? If, for example, this levee structure, according to Army Corps, cannot be accredited, are you still saying that people in the Groveland neighborhood would have to maintain flood insurance?
So we still have work to do to determine whether
Jack,
it can be accredited.
We still have work to do during the design phase to determine if accreditation is possible or not at this point.
Are you confident that it could be attained?
We wouldn't want to get people's hopes up to say that it is possible, but we're not sure at this point in time.
Do you foresee any residents being impacted to the point where, there would be new claims? For example, do the base flood elevations that you see impact any residents north or south of the project area?
No, that is one of the things that we definitively looked at and determined through our modeling efforts. At the request of the village, we had gone above and beyond. We went to a 2D model, which looks very specifically at areas above and below, very closely in a very narrow window, and there are no impacts above or below the levee as currently planned.
So is that different from the regulatory map that FEMA provides for the area north and south of the project area? In other words, the active risk map, for example, shows graduated base flood elevations from 31st Street to the Hoffman Dam.
Correct.
And the regulatory risk map that FEMA has put out shows homes being affected that weren't shown in your initial modeling. Do you foresee that during the design phase that may change? Will you recognize that homes that are on the FEMA risk map that's active right now would be represented in your modeling?
So the modeling that we have done, we have gone back and looked at the maps, and the maps that are indicated there.
There's a correlation.
There is a correlation between the two.
So you would recognize the cross sections that FEMA has in place right now and correlate that with the new data points that you have gathered through the Groveland Avenue or the limited Groveland Limited Strategic Study.
The flood map that you're referring to, the FEMA flood map, would be changed by what would be a letter of map revision request by the village. And that can be a part of this project should we be able to determine that we can accredit the levy.
So that there may be new graduations of base flood elevations.
So those would not change because the modeling indicates that there is no increase or decrease in the flow levels of the river based on installation of the levee.
But I mean, if there's an existing cross-section, say cross-section X at roughly 31st Street, and it says currently 616 feet above datum, is that something that would change?
So if the cross-section is in that map, we would have to work with FEMA about, I don't know the exact process. I know what happens is that they do put in.
Do you think FEMA stands by the map? I mean,
yes.
You stand by the map.
Right, we have to. It's not my map.
Right.
It's not the Army Corps map.
Are they going to require that your data correlates with what they have existing in the map?
So what they would require is that we use the currently recognized regulatory model to show that the inclusion of a levee at the location that's planned does not increase base flood elevations in the area.
See, this is what I guess a lot of us have never really understood, because the river itself is on an incline, so.
Correct.
There's a slope.
Yep.
And the FEMA map, the active FEMA risk map, shows that by showing, here's a cross-section of data, it's at 616.
Yep.
Here's a, inundation on the map showing that water actually comes into Maplewood Road from the river.
Right.
And yet, your modeling initially kind of showed that there was a lake there, but then you took it away. And so then it looked even less like the regulatory maps that residents are looking at today. And frankly, that map dictates whether people are on the floodplain or not.
Correct. So the indications we had from Maplewood residents was that our initial modeling was incorrect, that lake that was shown on that road was inaccurate.
About that, because we're getting discovery. I've learned so much more about hydrology than I ever wanted to know.
I'm sure.
And thank you for helping with that too, but
yeah.
The map shows.
Can you let Jeff finish what he was getting ready to say?
Absolutely.
So we had brought that initially, and the indication from residents was that that lake did not exist or that it never occurred. So we went back and we checked our modeling in the 2D model, and the 2D model did have an interface with the 1D model at that point where it incorrectly showed water flowing in there based on the 2D model. But that does not necessarily reflect a change that would occur in the regulatory model. The regulatory model would still reflect exactly what's in the FEMA model.
I mean, what level were you measuring that at? Because this was below the 100-year. What occurred was below the 100-year. Are yours at the 100-year? Because we were right at that.
I'm sorry, I did not understand what you're asking.
Miss, why don't we have one question at a time?
I'll stand down for a moment.
So ma'am, if you'd like to come on.
Thank you. Monica Moderato, Maplewood. I guess my question is, the modeling is at what water level?
So the 2D modeling that we presented shows a 100-year 1% chance flood elevation level.
We have not occurred yet.
No, so I was mistaken in that earlier. We have had over a 100-year flood here back in the 2013. Right.
Yes, ma'am.
Do you want to continue our discussion?
Now let's.
I just have one quick question. Where,
Ma'am, you need to go up to the microphone.
Therese Cochran on Maplewood. I wasn't at the previous meeting, but where are we talking about where the river actually flowed from the river into the street?
On the model.
Oh, on the model, yes.
Okay, we can't, people at home have to be able to hear this, so if you want to respond to her, you're going to need to go up to the microphone.
Okay. So on the model, you're talking about.
So in our original model, we had a little, I don't know what would you call it, a little lake.
Sure,
We'll just refer to it as a lake.
Yeah, I know, and it
Yes.
showed the river going into the street.
Yes, it was like
In the
between
middle of the
two
block.
homes.
Okay.
It was like between a
Okay.
couple homes that it flowed
Okay, but
through.
that's never occurred.
That's the indications we've had from residents.
Well, because that's my property, so I'm saying it has never occurred.
Right.
Okay, but then where was the picture?
The FEMA map, the actual FEMA map shows that it does occur. In fact, it shows right by your house. You
Yes.
look at, and this is on the village website. And this is, if your property's here,
Yes.
you have to have flood insurance. You're in the flood zone. And yet, we didn't, you said that we never saw it, but it doesn't matter to FEMA. This is what FEMA says. You're in the flood zone because we drew it.
But this has never, ever, ever occurred.
It doesn't really matter if it ever occurred.
But then how did you say there was pictures where the river came from? Oh, okay. Okay, okay.
I just don't understand why your modeling didn't show the same 100-year flood as FEMA shows in their map?
So the 2D model that we showed you is not considered the regulatory model that FEMA uses for their flood maps.
I see. It's not the regulatory model. So
It
you're
is
not
not the
required to
regulatory.
show residents.
So we
what
showed
actually
you, so we
happens.
showed you the regulatory model, and you determined that that was not good enough for your consideration of this. So we went back and we went.
That it wasn't good.
I'm not saying you did. The residents indicated that that was not good enough for their consideration in this project. You requested an advanced model, which is a 2D model, which has just recently been developed. And so we went back and we said, okay, we will look at the 2D model. We did what we had to do to produce that 2D model. It is not considered the regulatory model. It would take adoption by FEMA, by the state, and many other agencies for it to become the regulatory model. It's possible in the future it could be, but at this point in time, the regulatory model is not the model that is the 2D model.
So I don't, there's a disconnect between what FEMA is calling its regulatory model and your modeling, and you have high standards that you have to.
So the regulatory model is actually the Army Corps of Engineers model that was developed in the 1999 feasibility study for the entire Des Plaines River watershed.
Okay.
So that is the model that we normally run, is the model that we usually use with the state of Illinois for building anything within the floodplain to show whether there's impacts or no impacts or not.
Yeah, I still think that residents are going to be confused by this because, you know, to your average Joe, that regulatory model that FEMA provides says one thing, and your modeling shows something completely different.
Well, we have that model as well, and we ran that and showed the same, that there are no impacts based on installation of a levee at that location. So we have that data as well.
Okay, I think that we're kind of going in circles right here about this. No,
I'm trying to get clarity with this because it's really important.
President Sells?
I think the best.
Excuse me a second, gentleman, trustee.
We have before us a discussion on an agreement, correct?
Correct.
And we're spending all our time talking about engineering and the details, and I don't think this is, I mean, we need to do that. We absolutely need to do that. It doesn't seem like a board meeting is the correct format for that. We need to be able to have these people sit down and be able to have an open discussion.
That's a good idea. I mean,
The village board is not an open
That'll
discussion.
happen in the design phase. When we sit down and do a design, then we'll have something to actually base these questions on.
Right.
We'll understand what it looks like. We'll have a chance for preservation folks, historical, planning and zoning folks, everybody, including ourselves, to look at it and see whether this is something we want to continue on or not want to continue on. But we're kind of just shooting darts into the air with no target right now. Because again, Peter, I think you have a very good point that we do need to understand and feel comfortable with why the engineers feel comfortable moving forward with a difference in two different models, right? I think that's a very valid point. Something I'm still struggling with as well is to try and understand the process that they go through to create a regulatory map. And what would trigger that? Because if something that we're doing now, I think your concern is, something that we may do now could trigger a change to that map, a negative change to the Maplewood folks. And that's, I think I've heard you loud and clear that that's what the concern is. And that's why I think we put in some belts and suspenders into the internal agreement to give us the opportunity to have community interface at each step that we go forward.
Absolutely, and duly noted and appreciated.
So I think to Trustee Pollack's point, though, I mean, really what we're talking about tonight are the two agreements. The project, the proposed project agreement or the partnership agreement, and the IGA with MWRD. Does anyone have any comments about those documents?
Yes. I just wanted to circle back to what Joe Ballerine said at the very beginning before the comments, and that was, why are we doing this when it is going to be expensive? Why don't we do it the cheapest way possible? And that is to have these discussions before we enter the design phase, because if we do pull out of it, then we owe the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District money. So why would we do that? Why would we spend money that we don't need to spend if we should just be looking at these things now, early on, before we enter the design phase? That's what
You don't know what you're looking at. I don't know, and I'm in the business. And so we never make decisions unless we have something that's concrete to look at and concrete to balance and something to provide to our engineers to identify and cross-check a third party to those things. We're shooting in the dark right now. We don't know the elevations, we don't know the properties that it may impact or not impact, because they haven't been able to put pen to paper yet. Same thing we did with our facility study. We had some people come in, we spent a little bit of money, and we had them go in and validate all the pieces of property that we needed to do. They came up with some diagrams and they provided them to us so that then we can all make decisions on whether or not we want to spend our money together. That's the same situation that we're trying to do here. The good thing is that they've allowed us, which they haven't on other projects, to compartmentalize, to give us baseline or benchmarks at where we can have that interface and where we can have that. So the MWR money, help us understand what that funds are for.
Essentially, they'll pick up the local portion of the cost of the project. How, as I had mentioned previously, if we decide to stop after the design phase, we would owe them our portion of the cost, not necessarily Army Corps of Engineers, but we would have to reimburse MWRD.
And what costs would those be?
Those would be the 35%.
And
of something we haven't spent yet. Because that's the 35% is for items that we would spend downstream. So during the design phase, we are not going to spend all that much money of the MWRs unless we choose to by using our own facilities and staff, because we're getting reimbursed for that. So to have these guys do a design, come back and present it, and then facilitate a community response, we're not spending any of the MWR money yet. That's what I'm trying to get. We're not going to spend it yet.
Okay.
Right?
Well, that's not
Good to know.
Not necessarily. Originally, under the kind of the standard IGA that MWRD puts forward, they were only willing to provide the local share of construction cost.
Mm-hmm.
In negotiations with our attorneys, they have now agreed to expand that to also include that they would cover the village's portion of the design cost.
Which is what? We're not going to have much cost as a village as a part of the design.
So we anticipate around a $700,000 design cost. So 35% of that is 210, something like that. And we're talking about a decision point prior to full execution of those design costs. So we're looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of around $100,000 probably, maybe 150 on the outside end. Depends on how many public meetings and how many changes we have to make along the way, and what those final costs would be.
So your split of the 700 regarding a schematic design, DD design, and then construction documents.
Yes.
What are your percentages? Because I think that's a helpful piece to understand.
So what we would be going for is a 50% design level that would give us the final layout, the final alignment, and final version of what it would look like. Going from 50% to 100% would be the final phase after a decision point at the 50% phase, where we would have the local village input based on what they would like to see. And so 50% doesn't equal 50% of the costs necessarily, given that there could be extensive redesign and revisions along the way, but it would be somewhere in that neighborhood of $100,000 to $150,000 of costs that could be incurred based on those types of designs.
The village piece.
Well, the 35% of that.
Yeah.
Which
Some
MWRD would front for
right,
us.
right.
But if it ends up not being used for what they're funding it for, which is flood mitigation, that's why they're doing it, we would have to.
And then at that 50%, that's when we have to be locked in. That's
So
at that point we make that
would-
decision.
Yes, we would want a final decision around the 50% design phase, because we would need to go into acquisition of properties, we would need to finalize to go out for construction contract. If you decide that you don't want to move forward with construction at that point, we wouldn't want to go into any of those phases where additional funds would be expended but would not be utilized.
That's where the big money triggers.
Correct.
So, but again, to have them do a conceptual design, have them come and do a village presentation and a community interface meeting, we'll have very little invested in, at risk for us. And at that point then is when we can trigger to say, okay, is this something we all really want to do or not do? We can have the Groveland folks in there, we can have the Maplewood folks in there, the East Avenue folks, and we can hammer through this. Because we also need to look at the gate or the wall or how we fix Forest Avenue. We haven't even approached what that would look like, right?
Correct.
We haven't done much at all as to what that would be in its open, unused stage, which is 99.9% of the time, or what it looks like when it's closed.
Yes.
Right? Is that movable panels that then could trigger an operational thing that we keep at Public Works? Or is that something that is pretty on-site stored gracefully somehow? And so those are all the kind of design things that need to come out so that then you guys can take a response. So I want to drive by this thing every day.
Right.
Right?
And the decision could be made earlier than the 50%, but we would definitively need an answer at the 50%.
I think when you guys provide conceptual designs, we will have a wonderful opportunity to have dialogue. And I think
would hope
we'll have
so.
a lot of it, and we should have a lot of it, right? We all have to feel comfortable with this. It impacts all of us.
Correct.
Right?
Some more than others.
Correct. Very much so, some more than others.
I have a couple questions.
Please.
Number one is more of a theoretical question.
Sure.
So if we were to go through this process, get to the 50%, have spent $100,000 and move back out of this, what is the value of the design at that point, as it stands, and it's theoretical, to us if for 5-10 years down the road, how much do these models change? And the reason I'm asking this is because with the facility study, we invested $80,000 to do that, but the value to me is that 5-10 years down the road, even if we don't do this right now, there's still value there. I'm concerned that we're losing value if 5 years from now,
We want to go back.
you wanted to restart this project and you basically have to start over at square one.
I can't comment 100% on what changes would happen to the model. I mean, the model predicts a certain future out into the certain number of years based on land use changes, et cetera. There are land use changes going all along the Des Plaines River as we speak. So that changes things over time. Those are tried to be accounted for in the model as much as possible. But I would say in 5 to 10 years, the information that would be produced by that would be very usable still. I mean, you would have to reopen it up and take another look at it. It would not be a zero, like you wouldn't gain all of it, but you wouldn't lose all of it either.
Okay.
It would be a small percentage you'd have to go back and redo and
Have to
relook at.
revalidate it.
Right.
It would
Okay.
make prudence to revalidate something.
Once something sits on the shelf for 18 months or greater, we have to go back and reanalyze some certain things and bring it back to double check standards and things like that.
Okay. Second question I had is, it sounds like we're fairly confident that this letter that indicated that we could pull out after the design phase, that is something that could be held up in court. But
Yeah,
it's
so-
not part of the agreement. It was obviously taken out. They'd have to go back through the Pentagon or whoever it is has to approve it.
Right.
So, I guess I just want to make sure that we are.
Well, yeah, there's not a lot at stake from the Army Corps' perspective, and I mean the regulations allow us to pull out, which is why they removed the explicit pullout from the agreement. But because everyone's so concerned, they were willing to give us the letter.
Okay.
And people need to understand that, Michael Mars did a really great job. We had certain things we tried to get in the agreement, but the Army Corps, it's the federal government. They use the same model. We actually did okay, I think. MWRD was more flexible because they're a local agency and they work with us all the time. But the Army Corps is very hesitant to allow changes to their standard contract, because once they do it with one, then everyone's going to find out about it, and they lose that ability. And also, because it's the federal government and the various layers of bureaucracy, substantive changes to that agreement can't be authorized even by the colonel in charge here. They have to, as you referenced, to be approved by the Pentagon, and that takes at least 6 months. So we had some limitations. But yes, the letter, I believe it's true, it's correct. But it's also correct that any funds spent on our behalf by the MWRD, and this is really an MWRD requirement, not an Army Corps requirement, they will want back.
Mr. Mack?
John Mack, Hoffman Dam River Rats. How did you people from the Army Corps decide that this wall was the right thing to build?
So.
No, this is not funny. Don't laugh.
So the Upper Des Plaines feasibility study was undertaken starting in 2002. It was a comprehensive study of the Des Plaines River and all tributaries. We looked at all the damages up and down the river to consider what flood damages could be removed from as much as possible. So during that process, we looked at hundreds of locations for reservoirs, flood walls, and other possible flood solutions. They were slowly whittled down to what could be feasible, and this is one of those projects that came out of that study as feasible because it does, as we mentioned before, have a positive cost share. It protects people, removes them from flooding, it reduces their risk for flooding, and so we are confident that this decision is one that is right. We have confirmation from the Illinois Department of Natural Resources. Their 2009 study indicated exactly the same results. The flood study done by the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District also recommended a flood wall in this location as part of their Des Plaines River study that they undertook. So we have 3 agencies that have looked at this area and have all indicated the same exact solution to this issue.
Have any of these agencies ever looked at alternatives to building this wall? Because under your Army Corps guidelines, you are supposed to present alternatives to any project. I have never seen an alternative presentation to this project anywhere. Have you done that?
Yes, so as part of the study process, we presented the alternatives that were available at the time. That was part of the process that we went through. And we looked at all of them up and down the river, and we had public meetings back in 2014 and 2013, and in 2014 as well, as we had a revision to it after the 2013 flood.
Did any of your studies alternatives, I've never seen one. I follow everything that goes on the river that I can possibly get my hands on to look at. All right. We have a potential here to solve this problem of flooding. The problem is not building the wall. The problem is the Burlington Bridge and the Forest Avenue Bridge. There is where your problem is. Does anybody realize that the Burlington Bridge has a concrete wall that blocks some of the openings and restricts the water flow underneath it?
So as part
Is there
of
any
our
problem to remove that wall as part of this project?
So as part of our study, we did look at the Burlington Railroad Bridge.
Yeah.
We had considered that as one of the alternatives. Originally, that was the alternative that had one of the better benefit cost ratios. But upon further consideration and looking at the other alternatives that were finalized in terms of other flood walls and reservoirs that were proposed further upstream, the benefits of that lowered and were not as viable as originally thought. In addition, the railroad has refused to consider any changes to their structure. And so with the lowering of the benefit cost ratio and the inability to work with the railroad to get something in place, the best alternative is still the flood wall. And I would note that even the IDNR study in 2009 looked at the bridge as well. They did note that it did have a significant lowering of the flood stage. However, it did not reduce flood risk. And that is one of the key issues that we have to consider. If you lower the flood stage, but it does not remove someone from the flood risk, then it's not a viable solution.
Flood risk is gonna be here if you build that wall at 650. It's still gonna be here. That wall is gonna push the water into RB High School. So you can live with First Avenue and RB High School being flooded. All right? We have a really golden opportunity here to rework the west bank between Forest and the Burlington Bridge, rework the underneath section of the Burlington Bridge, take out the concrete walls that are under it, do this project without condemning anybody's property, not doing any influence to the landscape or the architecture of the village of Riverside. This can be done, and probably at less cost than what you're proposing right now. And in the pre-Hoffman Dam removals, there was a whole flood study done on the Burlington Bridge. It was basically instigated, I believe, by a man named Gerald Wilson, who used to live on West Avenue. All right. All that modeling was done with the Hoffman Dam in place. It was never considered when the Hoffman Dam was gone. Now that we've got Fairbank Road, the sewer system is separated out, the river capacity from the Burlington Bridge is going wider, the channel is deepening, it has more flow capacity. Building the wall is not the solution. If anybody on this board would like to see what these walls and pumping stations look like, drive up on River Road the other side of Des Plaines. If you want that in your backyards, so be it. The other question I have, because I talk to everybody around, there are residents that are considering suing the village to stop this. Whose legal money is it going to be when they do it, and you people have to defend them lawsuits? Even if you win, this isn't going to be cheap. And who's going to bear the brunt of any legal action against the village and the Army Corps and MWRD for the legal expenses? Anybody got any ideas? Anybody willing to comment on that? Because there are people already got the lawyers lined up. And the minute you start trying to condemn any of their property, that's what's going to happen. So it's up to you people, but you should really reconsider what you're getting yourself into here. This needs a whole lot more study before you commit any more money to it and give anybody approval to do anything. There's a solution to this flood problem along Groveland and West Avenue and Maplewood that could be built on the west bank and underneath the Forest Road Bridge and never impact any residential property whatsoever. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mack. Okay, so with regard to the agreements themselves, are there any comments about the agreements themselves? Yes, sir, please.
The choice there, what they want. Steve Campbell, 372 Fairbank. Although I don't live on Maplewood or Groveland, we have experienced substantial flooding a number of times also where the street is impassable. This relates to the documents themselves. The MWRD agreement stipulates that if we pull out, we have to reimburse all of the money that they have advanced directly to the Corps on our behalf. So based upon however much it's supposed to cost in the design phase, we'd be on the hook for that. In addition, the MWRD agreement at the first whereas says that due to the height of the Groveland berm and groundwater and drainage from surrounding properties, that's why the flood wall is needed. But in none of the floods has there ever been an overtopping of the berm of Groveland as it exists today. It was rebuilt quite a number of years ago. So to me, that's a material misstatement about why we're considering this project. So that's two big things, because if we pull out, we're gonna be on the hook for something. Now, I don't wanna put Mr. Zucker on the spot, but so until the design is done, we've either committed that we're pulling out or we're gonna stick into the bitter end, we don't have to do any property acquisition before that.
Correct.
Okay? In the village's capacity to acquire property, you answered on the first question that the village has the legal authority per state statutes, and I concur. But then in all the other questions related to property acquisition, the statement was it's anticipated that the Corps of Engineers is going to take care of it. So, to me, that's a little bit confusing, not to mention the fact that the PPA calls for us to advance the money for RR. So, lands and easements and relocations and rights of way and repair. And it strikes me as truly bizarre that the Army Corps of Engineers can't say, this is about where we're gonna put the flood wall, because there's the river and the riverbank. So how much can it vary east to west? 10 feet, 15 feet? And that's not the majority of the land that's gonna be required, because all the stuff they dig out needs to be stored until, it doesn't say what's gonna have to be done with it. And as far as the environmental responsibility, you know, I've heard of millions of people a year that go to Las Vegas and they're very optimistic and they still leave broke. I don't think that that's a fair stewardship of all of our monies for now and into the future. Plus, we are responsible for all of the environmental assessments, and based upon the fact that the village remediated the site that had a no further remediation required letter, if we really had a problem, God knows what it would cost. And if they're gonna be piling this stuff during construction, does that mean that some of those poor people on West and Groveland are gonna have to look at piles of river sediment for years? And everybody says, oh, it's gonna be taken care of with a future agreement, you know? Mr. Attorney Molina just said that the colonel doesn't have the authority to make substantive changes to the agreement. But it seems to me that removing a pullout and you're gonna pay the money back clause is pretty substantive. So what happens if he's retired, we get into a disagreement with the Corps, and they just go, we didn't have the authority. Where's his letter of office? He didn't have one. And to me, all the hypotheticals, everybody just kind of blows by. But these are real exposures. If an insurance underwriter knew about these, your premium would be modified based upon the potential loss. Truly. And, you know, they were using all this modeling, and they were using LiDAR level 3, and they talked about that at the April 18 meeting. But yet, the village had purchased LiDAR 1 2 years earlier. Is it just me, or was the group as a whole kind of just not dialed into what our inventory and our assets are? So all of this concerns me for the validity of the models, of the need. I mean, how much, if I could ask, how much of an actual rise in the river level does all this hypothetical in the future dictate? Is it a foot and a half, 5 feet?
We'd have to get back to you on that.
I mean, FEMA raised the flood elevation for the Des Plaines River 3 feet, right around 2,000. Now they're gonna raise it another 3 feet? No, that 3 foot freeboard is so that the flood wall project can be accredited and get the money. Also, you talked about the $4.5 million that you're gonna spend, but yet there's a statutory limitation of 10. Theoretically, if the cost for the project went up to $3 billion, who's gonna have to cough up the $3 billion?
So the statutory $10 million is on the federal side, so a total project cost would be somewhere in the neighborhood of about $17 million.
Oh, but I'm just saying,
15, I'm doing bad math, 15.5.
so, but if it went $3 million higher over estimates,
Then
then
you'd
you
be
pay
at $10 million
two.
total. I'd
You pay all the
I'd pay
overage,
2, and you
and the village would have to pay one.
correct.
Well, what was the last time that a government project came in at cost estimate? That doesn't seem to be our experience locally lately. So all of these things just add to an increased financial risk. And environmental, you know, we have to get all the permits, we have to get all the reports. I really think that it's not just about the flood wall for the people that live there. This is about a village-wide major financial exposure that makes the infrastructure fee look like change at McDonald's. So I think that it needs to be considered more. The document, the PPA that we are looking at says draft. How can you discuss it and vote next time? Is it gonna be the same document? Is it gonna say draft or is it gonna say final? We need to see the final document, you know, and as much as Jeff, Mr. Zucker, estimates what the cost of owning it is gonna be, I have made a request for the OMRR&R, the operation manual for the wall that we are going to be contractually obligated to fulfill. The village has not yet responded to my request under FOIA. I don't know if that's just because everybody's that busy or whether we don't have one. I don't know if the manager's willing to answer that question. I don't want to put her on the spot, but if we don't have one, it's pretty hard to commit to, you know, fixing something in a certain way and saying it's only gonna cost this much. And all these future documents, no, it's contained in the four corners of the document. And anything that somebody says isn't worth diddly if it comes around to having it settled in a court. And I'm concerned that we're not being advised of the exposure of taking people at their word, because that doesn't seem to be the majority of the way things work in the world today. So I would ask that you slow this down, you reconsider, but there are a substantive number of, it seems, errors and omissions that need to be considered to be fair to the village. That's all. So I don't see why you need to rush it. It hasn't been vetted to the entire village. And it's not just a neighborhood issue, because we're all gonna have to pay for it. And the issue of taking people's land, I don't see how you can commit a dime until we get a rough idea of how much they're gonna take from the riverbank. I mean, what if they were coming to take part of your property, but you didn't know, they wouldn't tell you? That's not the way it is in America. And what happens if somebody says, not gonna sell it to you, you're gonna pry it from my cold, dead hands, then the village is gonna undertake the eminent domain action? Because you say that you have the authority, although not quick take. And nowhere does the Corps, in any of the agreements, acknowledge that they will undertake the responsibility, and we're supposed to front the money for that. And there's $1.5 million in the budget for that work, which, by the way, if I add up the 4.5 and the 2.5, that's the 7 million. Where's the $1.5 million come from? Do we have to put all that in? Or does that go into construction costs?
I'm sorry, which one are you talking about?
For land, easements, rights of...
Yes.
Yeah, so we have to front the money in the purchase, is what the agreement says.
Correct.
And then, but if
That's
we take,
credited as part of the 35%.
but is it part of the construction costs?
It's part of the total project cost. Construction costs are completely separate from land acquisition.
I think we need a little better detailed accounting of this, because I just wanna see how that's all broken down. Like, if it runs 3 million over, and we're on the hook as a village for an extra $1 million. And MWRD is capped at what they're paying us. So everything over and above that, we own.
Thank you.
You know, if, instead of a referendum for facilities, why don't you have a referendum for this? Really see what the residents think. And whatever the majority thinks, that's what we do, because this is America and this is a democracy. But sometimes it seems like things aren't. And I'll be back for zoning.
Okay. Hour is late, so
Can I just ask one more question, Jeff? Did the Army Corps build levee 37 on River Road?
Yes, we did.
Okay. So if we took that picture, is that a pretty fair
Yes, that
picture
would
of
be-
what the people would see?
Something along those lines, yes.
Okay. I would recommend that I can forward this picture to you, and I would recommend you at least send this over to Preservation so they get an idea.
I think I had provided one of the Levy 37 pictures previously too as an example of a flood wall.
We have a couple examples posted on the village website.
okay. So now we'll move on to the next item under considerations, which is a discussion of notice requirements in zoning matters.
President Sells,
Yes?
I would like to ask if we could table this to another meeting, given the hour and need for a closed session.
That's entirely up to you.
I'll make that motion.
So we have a motion to,
I'll second it.
motion and second to
To
table
the
this.
first
to
meeting, well, second meeting in January?
Second meeting in January.
I don't know if we'll be able to get Attorney Molina.
We can-
Attorney
there's no
Martin.
notice, so it can be
I just know
indefinite.
that
Yeah.
Michael's here, I believe.
It can be indefinitely.
So that's fine. We can do second meeting.
I'm sorry, I did not
It-
hear what the motion was.
So the motion is to table this discussion until the second meeting in January.
The zoning.
The zoning,
The zoning
the
discussion.
presentation, it was really Michael and I presenting on questions that have been raised about zoning and notice requirements and their relationship with the municipal code and due process.
So any comment about that? All right, call the roll, please.
Trustee Lumsden.
Aye.
Trustee Peters. Aye. Trustee Pollock.
Aye.
Trustee Valerie.
Aye.
Trustee Jesus.
Aye.
Motion carries. We do not have any new business. We do have need for an executive session to consider the appointment, employment, compensation, discipline, performance, or dismissal of specific employees. And ask for a motion second to adjourn, not to reconvene. No final action will be taken. Motion by
I'll move.
Ms. Peters,
I'll second.
second by Mr. Lumsden. Please call the roll.
That's my favorite.
Trustee Lumsden.
Aye.
Trustee Peters. Aye. Trustee Pollock.
Aye.
Trustee Valerie.
Aye.
Trustee Jesus.
Meeting is adjourned. Thank you. Good night.